You'll be glad to know this is the last video in Key Area 17 looking at something called speciation. It's quite a long key area this, and we've covered quite a lot, but moving on to have a look at what is it? Well, it's a formation of a new biological species, and it's brought about by evolutionary change. And we're going to have a look at two types of speciation. One is called allopatric speciation, and the other is called sympatric speciation. So, what do we mean by allopatric speciation? Now, this occurs when the gene flow between two or more population is prevented by some sort of barrier. You remember we talked about this before when we were looking at genetic drift. And that barrier could be something like a river or a mountain range or a desert or a sea. And in summary, what we're talking about here is we've got a large interbreeding population. And what happens, some sort of barrier comes between in that population. And so you end up with population A and population B, with the population has been split in half by the barrier. And these populations have both been isolated. Now what will happen is that just through normal mutations and through random variation, you're going to have some individuals in the, say, this side of the population, and some of those individuals, say, imagine that there's some sort of large mutant that randomly appears. And in the same way across here on the other side, here's a wee random mutant here, which is a small mutant. And that's just there in the population. Now, what happens, or what can happen, is that, you know, you might get some sort of natural selection that actually favours the mutants. So over on this side here, then it might be that there are drier conditions over here, and the large mutants survive better over there, and the large mutants favour those dry conditions. On the other side of the barrier here, it's maybe a bit wetter, and here you could find that small mutants may favour the wet conditions. So over a long period of time, natural selection will increase the frequency of the new alleles over on this side here, the large mutant, and over on this side here, the smaller one. And you end up with a situation where you have a species A here being formed, a species B being formed, because what is found is that over this long period of time, these two species actually become so totally different from each other that they can't interbreed. And the definition of a species, if you remember from your National 5, are two organisms that are able to breed together and produce fertile offspring. So here you'll see here, I've just got this note here, speciation has occurred because species A and B cannot interbreed even if the barrier ends up being removed. They've become so different from each other. And there's a couple of examples of allopatric speciation. One of them here is with the London Underground being built. You wouldn't think that that would be a place for evolution to be occurring, but it has been found that that has occurred. Above ground, before the underground was built, there's a common European mosquito, which can tolerate cold conditions. It's an above ground mosquito. It tolerates cold conditions by hibernating. It's called Culex pipiens, something like that, its name. But when the underground was being built, then a splinter group of these mosquitoes went underground, and when the tunnels were being built, and they exploited that new niche that was there, that new ecological niche. And there has been a new species that has developed called Culex pipiens molestus. It's called that because it was discovered during the war and the Blitz, when people were hiding underground or sheltering underground, that these mosquitoes were a real pest to people and biting them and so on. And they've developed a taste for human blood. But these mosquitoes, they're now cold intolerant. They can't live above ground, and they're genetically different from their above ground relatives. So it's almost impossible for them to interbreed. So they are defined as a new species, or certainly very well on their way to the new species. I think there might be a little bit of debate over whether they actually become a new species or not, but they're certainly very well on their way. Of speciation, or of allopatric speciation, is the South American mainland. There was one species of finch, but on the Galapagos Islands, it's been found that there are many different finches with different beak sizes and shapes. Now, the Galapagos Islands are off the South American mainland, and it's thought that the mainland finch was carried by some freak weather to the island. And then allopatric speciation occurred with the sea as a barrier. So the finch was out of there in the island, and it started to speciate, to become quite different from the finch that is on the South American mainland. But after that, something called Sympatric speciation occurred. And nowadays on the Galapagos Islands, there's found all these different examples of finches that are here on this diagram here, all different from the original mainland species of finch. So we're going to have, I mentioned there, Sympatric speciation, and we're going to... Now, Sympatric speciation is when you've got two or more populations and they're living in close proximity in the same environment, but they become in some ways genetically isolated. And this happens due to some behavioural or ecological barrier, or by the occurrence of polyploidy, for example, in plants. We look at this in a kind of summary. Imagine you've got a large population of interbreeding fruit flies living on a hawthorn bush. So they're not separated out, or they're not, they are living together. And some sort of alternative ecological niche appears, i.e. a human comes along and they put an apple tree in there. Then what happens is that some of these fruit flies will start to exploit that new niche. They'll move from the hawthorn bush to the apple tree. And so the two populations are now exploiting different food sources. And what happens is that their behaviour becomes some sort of isolating barrier. They're in different areas. These ones here in the apple tree, and these ones here on the hawthorn bush. And their behaviour isolates them, and over time what happens is they start to become very different from each other until they can no longer interbreed. And we'll have a wee look at how that happens. Here we've got our two populations, our ones in our hawthorn bushes, our ones in our apple tree, and it may be that there are some mutants that are in there, and they're better adapted to exploit that new resource. So they're able better to, maybe they're better camouflaged on the apples, for example. There's some kind of more rosy red colour, as the diagram is here. So they're better adapted there in that apple tree. Natural selection, therefore, will then favour those new mutants, and eventually, over a period of time, two genetically distinct species are formed. And eventually, as I said at the beginning of this, they become so different they can no longer interbreed. So that's our two types of speciation. I want to just speak for a moment or two on this term here, hybrid zones. Now, we've talked here about species which cannot all interbreed. But in an environment, you may have several subpopulations of a species, and some of them can interbreed with others and not with all of them. So I've got this wee diagram here to help to explain that. Here you've got population A, B, C and D. Now, in these subpopulations, A is able to breed with population B here. So you've got this hybrid zone here. But A cannot breed with C, and A cannot breed with D. And in the same way, B, on this diagram here, B is able to interbreed with population A and population C, but not with population D. So you get this hybrid situation happening. So in this diagram here, each subpopulation can breed with its neighbour, but it may not be able to breed with more distinct members of the species. And hybrid zones exist where interbreeding is possible, and as a result, genes are able to flow between subpopulations. So A's genes are able to flow into B's population. And because of that, because the B population breeds with the C population, in actual fact, A's genes, although there's not direct breeding, some of these genes will flow through to C. And in the same way, B's genes will flow through there as well. And then some of these C genes will be able to breed, to flow through to the D population. So you get this flow through the subpopulations. And in the same way, D will be able to flow back the way to A. Now, where population B and C become extinct, then gene flow is disrupted and population A and D cannot breed together, and therefore they become two different separate species. In the diagram that I've got here, I've got species A, a separate species. C is, and this one here, sorry, it's population A and, no, it is population B and C that become extinct, although in this diagram here C is still remaining. But if C had been removed, then population A and D would just be on their own. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about these hybrid zones, because when it comes to the area of speciation, it's not always as clear cut. You know, one day an animal or an organism has become a new species. There's kind of shades in between that process happening. And that is the end of Key Area 17.